So some of you have asked me to go back over current account and capital account. I don't think this is a bad idea. I know for some of you, you're puzzled because you weren't in class, and for others, you're puzzled because we didn't do a great job the first time through or because there were other things going on. And I think it's not that tricky once you get your head around it, but it seems like it can't be what it is, given all of the furore around it in the news and how people perceive it. So let's again walk through this. Just going through my notes here. Let's see if we can refresh. Trade is good and trade creates wealth. And wealth improves the lives of children and the environment. And a key thing in thinking about trade is that exports are how we pay for our imports. It doesn't mean we don't want to export things, but it is to say that exports are a cost. From the point of view of the producer who is selling goods to foreigners, exports are a benefit. They're extra revenue for them. But from the point of view of a society and from a nation, things that are shipped abroad and sold abroad are things that cannot be used, consumed, or enjoyed by a country's citizens. So if America exports something, Americans don't get to consume that or use that item. Again, it doesn't mean we don't want to export, but it's saying that exports are a cost. They're on the cost side, and on the benefit is our import side. So the benefit of trade, international trade, is the gain that we get, the enjoyment and the satisfaction that people get out of the goods that are imported, and the cost is our exports. This, I would argue, is generally the opposite of how most people perceive trade, but that doesn't nonetheless change the fact that it's true. So if trade is good between individuals, that means each individual thinks it's the best deal they can get, which would mean that trade between individuals who think it's the best deal they can get must be good across borders. Again, unless you are going to build a model of the world in which you know more than everybody else, and the question would be, how do you know more? And do you know more on all subjects? Probably not. In which case, we probably need to acknowledge that our citizen may well know where the best deal is. So, as ever, the question would be, does the logic from the individual level apply at the national level? In other words, economics is a study of phenomena of human action but not human design, and so maybe when we aggregate this up to the societal level, things change. So, one of the key ones here is that gains from trade are going to occur regardless of the currency that you're using. In other words, regardless of the colored pieces of paper that you're using. Now, from the point of view of the book, the rate of savings is important. We're getting close enough to this. After the exam, we'll jump in on the market for loanable funds and look at what determines our rate of savings. This may have some relevance, particularly for budget deficits, but I don't think it has much of an impact for international trade. And here we have that the market clearing price and quantity of holding a currency must mean that their purchasing power is similar. Again, we haven't covered that. We will probably get into that before too long. The key for this at this point is to think big picture and talk big picture about trade deficits and trade surpluses, capital account, etc. So what you typically hear of as when people talk about a trade surplus is some idea that surpluses are good. Now, hopefully by this point you go, well, no, not necessarily. We've seen some cases of surpluses being good, but we've seen others where they're bad. So in 2010, Iraqis exported $49 billion worth of goods and services. And in 2010, they imported $42.56 billion worth of goods and services. And so most people say, woohoo, this is amazing. We have a $6.5 billion trade surplus. It's surely good, right? In other words, Iraqis sold to foreigners $6.5 billion worth of goods more than Iraqis bought from foreigners. If you think about exports being a cost, this sounds like Iraqis are getting a bad deal. Of course, we don't want to assume that Iraqis are stupid here, and so maybe there's something behind this. So let's look at a trade deficit. Now, you've A budget deficit, I think most of us understand that's probably not a good thing if we're in a personal situation where we have a budget deficit, or if you have a corporation that is running a budget deficit, that's also going to be problematic. Attention deficit disorder is also oftentimes viewed as a problematic thing. Late life diagnosed with that, I've been learning to deal with it, and my life would be a lot easier if I didn't have attention deficit disorder. So, deficits are bad? I'm not so sure. Let's look at this. The United States in 2010 exported $1.27 trillion worth of goods and services and imported $1.9 trillion worth of goods and services, yielding what we will call a trade deficit of $633 billion, dwarfing the Iraqi trade surplus. That's a terrible thing, right? Foreigners sold us $600 billion, more than $600 billion worth of goods and services than they demanded in return. Again, the question might be how we got away with it, but I think that if we stop and think about it, we would realize running a trade deficit of $633 billion is amazing. That's a great thing, unless we're missing something. So the upshot here is that more foreigners bought stuff from Iraqis than Iraqis bought from them. Now, on the surface, that sounds kind of attractive. That means that Iraqis had attractive goods. But attractive compared to what? Turns out also more foreigners sold stuff to Americans than bought things from Americans. Which is better? Now, one reaction could be, look, neither of them are better. They're just like prices. What's the best price for a gallon of milk? What's the best price for a roll of toilet paper? The best price for a roll of toilet paper in this present environment is whatever it is, right? It's driven, so prices are an emergent phenomenon, just like international trade flows are an emergent phenomenon. They are not things that anybody has control over, and so it's not necessarily, right? It's not really an issue of which is better. So that might be one response. You might say, look, neither is better. They're just a natural response of people making decisions about where they think they can get the best deal. Cool. But maybe we do want to start thinking about which of these you would prefer. Now, it's not to say that you actually can affect these or put a thumb on the scale, though if you're Donald Trump, you might be able to with export subsidies or import tariffs or a variety of things. So I think there is a relevant policy question here. Now, it turns out that deficits and surpluses are around in our private lives, and they are around in international trade as well. Turns out that I run a trade deficit with almost everyone in Billings. Now, I used to run probably a larger trade deficit with people in Billings than I have over the last 2 weeks. My trade deficit with Amazon has gone up. My trade deficit with some of my internet providing, my streaming services has probably gone up. While I have been eating a fair bit of takeaway, I probably am running a trade deficit that has decreased here with the other people in Billings. Is that a good thing? I think we understand. No, it's not a good thing. I would love to be able to go out and sit outside on a beautiful spring afternoon and have a beer. That's not really an option. And so my trade deficit has gone down, but that does not mean that I'm better off. Of course, reasoning from the individual to the aggregate is probably a little bit puzzling. Maybe we want to be a little careful with it, but that's where I like to start. So again, right, no Friday lattes for me. I can get McDonald's for my evening meals, but it's a little bit more complicated. I haven't made a run to Costco since this whole thing has popped off here, but typically I run a large trade deficit with Starbucks, McDonald's, Costco, Amazon. With my Triumph motorcycle, I run a trade deficit with my landlord. I import their lodging and I just give them colored pieces of paper. I don't actually export any goods or services to them. Now, this is an important thing. People say, no, but you paid money. That means you exported something to them. And no, it doesn't. That's one of the keys here to understanding trade deficits and trade surpluses, is what we care about is the value of goods and services. The colored pieces of paper are just ways to keep track of where things are going. Now, it turns out I run a trade surplus with only one group in Billings, and that would be MSUB students or possibly MSUB taxpayers who are subsidizing your education. So if we want to talk about America running a trade deficit with China, from my point of view, that's utterly nonsensical. If we care about something, it certainly is not whether we are running a trade deficit or a trade surplus with a specific group. It would be whether we're running a balanced terms of trade overall, if we wanted to run balanced terms of trade. But it turns out that trade deficits and surpluses are everywhere, and actually they are necessary. They're essential for us to get the gains from specialization and trade. If we couldn't run trade deficits and trade surpluses, then we wouldn't be able to, then we would have to find balanced terms of trade. We couldn't be exporting things from China we couldn't be importing things from China and then not exporting to them. So as I hope you remember from that circular kind of flow diagram of Iraq and Turkey and China, much international trade, Turks might sell things to Iraqis, and they take those Iraqi dinars so that they can then buy things from people in China. But the only reason why people in China will take those Iraqi dinars is because they want to buy something in Iraq. And what that money does is simply reduce transaction costs. If we were to restrict trade, if every country had to run balanced terms of trade, Iraqis would have to find things that Turks wanted that the Iraqis could exchange for the things that Turks have. And they would have to find things that Chinese people wanted that they would be willing to exchange for things the Chinese would send to Iraqis. If you had to do balanced terms of trade like that, that's going to just be a lot more complicated and a lot more time consuming. And so deficits and surpluses allow us just to find the person who has what we want and conduct the exchange. Or to find the person, I don't know what I said. Did I say has what we want? How about this? Yeah, it allows us to find the person who wants what we have and conduct the exchange. And then in the big picture, this can wash out. And so what this means is that deficits and surpluses are necessary for higher levels of social coordination, but nowhere along in here do they create debt. They do when we trade those colored pieces of paper. That does allow somebody in the future to trade those colored pieces of paper in for goods and services in the United States if the colored pieces of paper were US dollars. But that doesn't give them a claim on my resources. So when I import, say, a board game from Germany, I send over those colored pieces of paper. So Ravensburger prints a game, and they sell it, and I buy it, or Aaliyah does, and they ship it to me, and I send them colored pieces of paper. Those colored pieces of paper don't create debt. There's no way that that Ravensburger or the head of Ravensburger could come back to me and say, you know what, I'd like some economics lectures. We gave you a board game, you owe us some economics lectures. That would be a case of debt. No, what they can do is say, hey, you know what, I have these colored pieces of paper here, and I'd like to use these colored pieces of paper for your goods and services. At which point we can negotiate, and if the amount that they're offering is adequate, then we can engage in a new trade, a separate trade. But that trade is not a function of debt. It is simply a function of trade. And so those colored pieces of paper people get very obsessed about. But in effect, all they allow us to do is to more easily find other people to trade with. So if we think about this, I hope it makes sense on a personal level. And again, the question would be, does this change when we look at the national level? And the answer is no. In short, the answer is no. However, that's not a very satisfying answer would be my guess, and so let's go over these. We have the balance of payments, the current account, and the capital account. And I suspect at this point, this may be where people get confused. But if you get confused at this point, hopefully you have something to fall back on. That's why I structure these the way I do, from the general to the specific. And just because you may not be able to get all the way to the specific should not keep you from getting as far as you can. Okay, so let's talk about these. What are these things? Well, the balance of payments is just a way to account, measure, evaluate the flow of goods and services. In other words, the flow of stuff, which as I mentioned is goods and services, and the flow of financial claims. Now, this could be debt, or it might not be debt. We're going to have to look at that. Typically, we're looking at bonds, stock markets, right, which would be a form of ownership, loans, and then just sticking money in a bank. So there's a lot of financial claims, a lot of debt, and a lot of ownership claims about things that will happen in the future. So when we set these up on a personal level, if there's no borrowing or lending, the amount that I spend is going to have to equal the amount that I earn. In other words, that trade deficit that I have with so many other people has to be balanced by that trade surplus I have with some people. Right? So with you all as students, I'm exporting and not importing anything. I'm exporting my lectures, I'm exporting my teaching, I'm exporting my time and energy with these videos and with chat and with grading exams and quizzes, and all you give me in return are colored pieces of paper. Now, if those colored pieces of paper weren't worth anything, I wouldn't take them. Those colored pieces of paper do allow me to square my trade deficit with other people. They allow me to go get things at Costco. They allow me to order 17 metric tons of toilet paper from Amazon. I'm not sure if they would even let me do that at this point. It would be kind of amusing. So that's without borrowing or lending. Now, if we permit borrowing or lending, then it turns out my spending or consumption can be greater than my earning, but only in the short run. Now, I say only in the short run because eventually creditors want to be paid back. So it also turns out that with borrowing or lending, maybe I should rephrase that more generally, with borrowing and lending, my spending or consumption can diverge from my earning, but only in the short run. Now, I could spend less than I earn in the long run if I wanted to, but generally speaking, that would be a foolish thing. I would end up dying with a bunch of unused resources, and I don't have any kids, I don't have any heirs. I could donate it to charity, but frankly, I think I would rather consume that and have an enjoyable life, or donate to charity along the way rather than in one big go at the end of my life. So basically, we understand on a private level what we would want to do is finish our lives where our balance of payments is fully balanced. Now, on a personal level, my current spending and earning is going to be called the current account, and this is going to be transactions that are finished in the current period. What's the current period? That's a good question. Typically, we view this as being a year, but again, just like GDP, we could talk about quarterly balance of payments, we could talk about monthly balance of payments, and in those cases, the current period would be that month or that quarter. The borrowing and lending is going to be the capital account. And again, in that, my consumption can be greater than my earning, but only in the short run. What this means is that if I'm running a trade deficit, that means my current account is negative. And it turns out that has to be balanced by a positive capital account, and vice versa. And so what this means, and you're going to have to take this on faith for just a moment, is that anytime somebody says America's running a large trade deficit with China, you could replace that and say America's running a large capital account surplus with China. Now, the former sounds kind of scary. The latter, which is equally true, doesn't sound nearly as scary. So I think a lot of the misunderstanding about international trade flows has simply to do with the use of the word deficit. So on a personal level, my earning minus my spending, that's going to be my current account, has to equal changes in savings, changes in ownership, and changes in cash. So if my earning is greater than my spending, I'm going to have to either, or some combination of these things, either I'm going to have to draw down my savings, which is going to be different than cash. In this case, what we're talking about is, I'm going to have to draw down my savings, I'm going to have to draw down my ownership stocks, or I'm going to have to use some of the cash that I have socked away. The right-hand side there is the capital account, or the CAR. Now, on a national level, this looks a little bit different. We have our current account is going to equal a negative times the capital account plus changes in reserves. For our purposes here, we are largely going to ignore the changes in reserves, but you want to remember that that's there in case for some country that's a particularly important or salient variable. So the current account. Well, it's not all that hard. Exports minus imports. Now, for most countries, that's the big piece there. Now, you hopefully now can remember that by remembering GDP is SIGEXM. Again, some people talk about net exports. I have not found that helpful. Then students forget, is it imports minus exports or exports minus imports? It's X minus M, just like the last two terms in GDP. But it's also going to be the repatriation of income from assets that are held abroad. So that would be the conclusion in the current period of transactions that took place in a previous period. So in other words, that would be coming from the capital account into the current account. So a previous year, maybe we sold stuff to people in China, and instead of asking for our money back, we built a factory in China. Now, the we being, I don't know, this class, not necessarily Americans. Maybe next year that factory makes some money. We manufacture goods and services. Well, what are we going to do with that money? Again, we could ship goods back into the United States. That would be the imports. We could just ship our money back into the United States. And again, that money being shipped back would be the repatriation of income from assets abroad. That again is also going to be net, so it's going to be out minus in, because there are going to be foreigners who are repatriating some of their income. We also then have net transfers. Now for the United States, that's not necessarily a major piece. For some countries, that's a massive piece. I think Indonesia oftentimes has large transfers. Basically, transfers could be foreign aid, or they could be a nation's citizens, or just anybody from outside that country transferring resources to them. And so again, when I was in Iraq, I would, whenever I got paid, I would go down to Western Union, hand them a big stack of cash, and I would have them transfer it to my bank account in the States. Now you might ask, is that income from assets that are held abroad, or is that net transfers? Truth is, it doesn't really matter as long as it's counted in one place and one place only. That, I would guess, I'm not a national statistician, but I would guess that would come under transfers. So again, transfers would be out minus in again. And as I mentioned for the United States, the major component that matters is the X minus M. But the others are relevant, certainly for the United States, but particularly for other countries around the world. So that's the current account at the national level. It is the flow of goods and services in the current period. And what it really is just stuff out minus stuff in. Now the capital account. The capital account is set up the opposite way. For some reason, it is in minus out rather than out minus in, which is why we need that negative sign for them to balance. And the capital account is going to be changes, basically it's going to be changes in foreign direct investment, portfolio investment, and other. So foreign direct investment is going to be new capital. Foreigners can buy new capital. Portfolio is going to be the transfer of ownership of existing capital to foreigners. Now these might seem similar, however, most share purchases are going to be under portfolio investment. When you buy a share in Apple, by and large, that is not new capital. Somebody else already owned that share, and you now own that share, which means the ownership has transferred from one person to another. So that's portfolio investment. And other primarily is bank deposits. So let's see if we can wrap our heads around this. It's important to remember that this is the opposite of the current account in terms of it is in minus out rather than out minus in. And then again, as I mentioned, the changes in reserves, governments hold currency largely to stabilize exchange rates. Some countries do it for other reasons. Sometimes reserves can change dramatically. Back in the 90s, Thailand saw a run on their currency, which largely crashed their currency, and they went through a mass quantity of reserves along the way. That almost certainly had an impact on the current and capital account of Thailand in that time period. But generally speaking, if you had to forget a piece, you could forget that piece. So let's see if we can map this on here. So in the wintertime, we're still oftentimes able to enjoy citrus even in the winter here. And where a lot of that comes from is Chile, because the seasons are reversed. So when it's winter here, it's summer in Chile. The beauty of having two hemispheres. So Costco buys some of those delicious oranges from Chileans. What are some options there for those Chileans? So Costco doesn't really care what the Chileans are going to do. Costco just hands over enough money to induce the Chileans to deliver their oranges. And now the question is, what should the Chileans do with that money, with those U.S. greenbacks, those dollar bills? Well, they could buy wheat. They could buy wheat from Montanans and ship it home. That would be in the current account. They could buy wheat from Montanans and ship it to Paraguay. That would also be in the current account of the United States. They could buy cars from Detroit. They could try and buy ventilators, although I think they're going to struggle with that at present. The key here is if they buy anything and ship it back, or alternately, if they take those dollars and change them into another currency unit at home, I don't know, is it the peso, the Chilean peso, I think. If they did that, then somebody else used those dollar bills to buy American goods and services, that still would be concluding in the current account. If they change the dollars into Chinese RMB, renminbi, or yuan, and somebody in China bought American goods with that dollar, then that still would be, that whole transaction would conclude in the current account. Maybe, however, the person who ends up with those greenbacks decides instead of buying American goods or services, they invest in a new venture in the United States. Verizon is maybe expanding its network and they need capital to put in place more infrastructure. That would be in the capital account. That would be foreign direct investment. Or also the investing in the Verizon network. Could be portfolio investment if they are just purchasing an existing share in Verizon. And then finally, the other option that they could do would be to put their money in the bank, which would again be in the capital account. It just would not be in portfolio or in foreign direct investment. The upshot of this is that because of math, a current account deficit must be matched by a capital account surplus, which is exactly what we see here. Because foreigners aren't going to give us their goods unless they can either get goods that they value at least as much, or if they can get investment opportunities that they value at least as much. And so the nature of this is that a capital account surplus is balanced by a current account deficit, and a current account surplus is balanced by a capital account deficit. And so any trade deficit must be balanced by a capital account surplus. Of course, there's an exception here, which is we could have a current account deficit and no change in our capital account with a dramatic decrease in reserves. So again, that's possible, but it's pretty unlikely. So now let's think about what this means. So the first thing is simply that because of basic arithmetic, a capital account surplus is balanced by a current account deficit. And there's a discussion in the book about whether our people are saving too little. I don't put a lot of stock in this because, frankly, that would require that our citizens are either dumb or that our citizens are sensible, but that we have poor incentives to save. Either way, whether you think people are dumb or whether you think that we have different costs and benefits, trade barriers are not going to change the underlying things that you would be concerned about there. So I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on that, particularly as we already talked about that some in class. Let's walk sort of big picture framework here. If we have if a capital account surplus is private, that would mean a current account deficit. Then foreign capital is making the interest rate lower than it otherwise would be. Put a pin in that until we come back to the market for loanable funds after the exam. This means our investment is higher than it otherwise would be. and foreign capitals help easing the problem. By the way, for those of you who are watching this, I guess you're the only ones who are hearing this, but you could reasonably start thinking about what this would do in our solo model as well. It turns out the barriers to trade are going to make a low savings rate a bigger problem if it is a big problem. Okay. So, if we have a current account surplus, that means we have attractive goods. And that sounds nice. The issue, of course, is that if we have a current account surplus, we have attractive goods relative to our investments. And that if we have a current account deficit, we have goods that are less attractive compared to our investment opportunities. So when you look at it without that compared to statement, it seems like you would want to be running a current account surplus. But maybe once you start thinking about what investments are and what that means, then here we have investments that are attractive. I'm going to largely discount the low savings rate. So we have attractive investments relative to our goods. Now, if you think about the fact that investments are really people's estimation of the value they're going to get in the future or be able to generate in the future by giving up things in the present, if people think they're going to be able to generate a lot of value in your country in the future, that tells us that they largely, unless they're investing in bullet manufactories or coffins, then they, or even if they are investing in coffins, there's a very good chance that they think the future is bright enough in your country that people are going to be able to afford those things and that people are going to, that the future is fairly bright. On the other hand, if you have a capital account deficit, that's going to be balanced by a current account surplus. And that means that you have attractive goods relative to your investments and that people would prefer to invest somewhere else. They say, screw you, we're not giving you our stuff for those colored pieces of paper. We want stuff back because we want to take that other stuff and sell it in a way where we can get the resources to invest somewhere else. So again, a current account deficit is always balanced by a capital account surplus, and a current account surplus is always balanced by a capital account deficit. And so if individuals rather than governments are choosing, then there's either no problem or foreigners are helping us fix the problem. If the main actor is foreign governments, on the other hand, then we might worry because maybe they are engaged in this for reasons of political favor. Or more importantly, from my point of view as an economist and a social scientist, maybe I would worry about this because there's no guarantee that resources are getting allocated effectively. But that is, in effect, a run through of the current account and capital account. I hope that's helpful for those of you who may have struggled with this on the first go round.